Hi, this is Brad.
And this is Katie.
And we're the hosts of
Decomposition Podcast.
I think considering the material we're working with, that language was neither shocking nor inappropriate.
It's upsetting and delightful. Much like
Yeah.
this song.
No, this is just rhyming nonsense.
Yeah, here to hyperanalyze all your favorite terrible songs.
From Billy Joel to Taylor Swift,
And Pitbull to Kiss,
we break down what makes these songs so good.
while they're so bad.
This is a postmodern commentary on human existence. Billy Shakespeare did write a whole bunch of sonnets. 154 to be exact. I am not suggesting that this is a good or artistic song in any way.
It's not good, but it's
great.
You can find us at decompositionpodcast.simplecast.fm.
Or subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast app.
Check out our new episodes every Monday, and remember,
They're not guilty pleasures.
if you don't feel guilty.
Hi, I'm Chris.
And I'm Christian.
And this is an advert for Echo On,
A true crime podcast.
We're a fortnightly podcast released every other Saturday where we talk about a variety of true crimes.
Whether it's cults, con men, serial killers, and everything in between.
So you can find us on all your usual podcast platforms.
Or you can go to our website on www.echoonpod.com.
Also on all your social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at Echo On Pod. So please subscribe, download, and give us a listen.
This podcast is part of the Michigan Sports and Entertainment Podcast Network. Go to michigansportsandentertainment.com for more great podcasts.
You are listening to In a City Like Yours, a semi-monthly podcast featuring interesting people with interesting life stories. This podcast may contain language and/or subject matter not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
I'm your host, Michael G. Moore. Please visit our website at inacityLikeYours.com. That's INACITYLIKEYOURS.com for links to our social media, all popular podcast platforms, and links of interest pertaining to all episodes. On this episode, I chat with Steve. Steve is a true crime podcaster who produces the podcast True Crime Fix. One of Steve's main goals for his podcast is to have each episode highlight the victim's life instead of focusing on the killer, and he does this expertly. We talk about his early interest in true crime and the psychology behind the evil minds of the perpetrators, as well as how to bring about meaningful change in some of the laws surrounding stalking and domestic abuse violence. Join us as we discuss all things true crime. Here is Steve's story.
Hi, I'm Steve Burgess. I'm from High Wycombe in England, and I am the host of the True Crime Fix podcast. We're available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere that you get your podcasts. And basically, me and Michael are going to have a chat today, and we're going to discuss about true crime, and we're going to discuss about how I actually got here with recording my podcast, because it's one long story. To be perfectly honest, the amount of bumps in the road, it's going to be a ride that you guys are going to be really interested about hearing. So basically, I've always been interested in crime, basically from an early age. The first experience that I had with crime was when I was about 10 years old. My parents and we used to go down to a local social club. And on the way home, we always used to have the radio on. Just hearing about the story, it was actually the story that I alluded to in my third episode, which was the story of J.C. Sawyer, who was a man in Georgia who was killed by a British man. And over the periods of time, the British guy was trying to make out that he was the victim in the case. He did some absolutely dastardly stuff. If you actually listen to the episode, then you can hear what sort of stuff he did. But he tried to play off against the victim, saying that he shouldn't have been executed, and it gripped me. I was 10 years old, and this is the first experience that I'd ever had with the idea that somebody was going to take somebody else's life. This was back in 1995, and I got obsessed with crime from there on in, because the idea that a country could actually kill somebody, I never knew about this. I mean, obviously Britain had capital punishment up until about 1963, I think it was. But that was way before my time. So I obviously didn't experience it when the UK had capital punishment. So the whole thing managed to really, really grip me. I then didn't really go anywhere with true crime when I was a child, because it was kind of considered a bit weird, to be fair. Fortunately now, with the obsession that has come since the start of podcasts and all these true crime documentaries that are on the television, I'm back in the norm again. And it's really the fascination about how people can actually do what they do to each other. I like to consider myself as a nice guy, and the idea that somebody can actually have a mindset where they actually want to end somebody else's life. So basically what happened was I took up football refereeing, when I was 14 years old, and I did that for a number of years. Got relatively high in the levels, got to the stage where I was actually a member of my local county academy, but I was doing silly amount of games per year, and not as it came to the summer and the pitches got harder and you had to keep running backwards and forwards and stopping and starting again. It just took its toll on my legs, and I would have to have time off with things like shin splints and dodgy ankles and dodgy knees, etc., which actually ended up culminating in 2015, but I'll get there in a minute. Whilst I was in sixth form, I did psychology as one of my subjects, and one of the cases that we studied when I was doing my psychology degree was that one of Kitty Genovese, which I also covered in episode 5. That's how I actually learnt about that case. It was about bystander behaviour, the way that people reacted when it came to an incident that took place, and the way that they would treat people screaming. The fascination in that, it then went on to looking into other cases. One of the other cases that I studied when I was in sixth form was the case of Harold Shipman, because that was just coming to a head when I was doing my psychology degree. Basically, it was a case where I went off and did a case study on Harold Shipman, and I looked into aspects of his life that made him the way he was. So, for example, he would have issues with his mother. He would have a narcissistic personality, things like that. Then went on to university, studied psychology and criminology at the Buckinghamshire Chiltern University College here in High Wycombe. At that time, I met Paul Britton, who was a famous profiler on the Rachel Nickel case. He was the person who was, well, basically he was infamous for setting a honey trap where a female police officer attempted to get the person who was they suspected of doing the crime to confess, but the way they did it, it was almost entrapment. So he was actually eventually struck off, but met him at a conference. So it was the idea of, once again, I'd like to go into looking into criminal profiling, but eventually criminal profiling, I had to do a master's degree, and it would cost a lot of money to actually do it. So I decided, do you know what, I'm gonna go into the world of housing. It's a long way when you go from a world of crime and psychology and the way that people are acting and people watching, to a world where you're looking after social housing tenants. Trust me, it's a massive difference. So yeah, I went into social housing. I started listening to podcasts with pretty much everybody else with the Adnan Syed phenomenon, which happened through Serial and Undisclosed and Truth and Justice with Bob Ruff. They were the first 3 podcasts that I really listened to. Then I got into Case File and listened to the stories, the way that the anonymous host of Case File tells the story. And it was the idea that one person could hold your attention for that long. And it was the first experience I remember where me and my now wife were going on a real long journey, and neither of us spoke to each other for about an hour and a half because we were both gripped by one of his cases. And the idea that that one person could hold somebody's attention like that, it blew me away. And then obviously got onto They Walk Among Us. The idea that a British guy could actually do a true crime podcast then got the cogs turning in my old brain. So I had to basically stop going any higher with my refereeing in April of 2015. What happened was I was getting off a bus when I was on my way to work, and I got knocked from behind by somebody who wasn't really paying any attention. They had their headphones in, didn't really notice me, and they basically took me out from behind, and I've taken a step off of the bus and my leg has caught the edge of the curb and my knee is basically bent backwards, which meant that I had MCL, ACL and meniscus damage, which kind of gave up, or I was out for about a year with that. And that kind of meant that I didn't really go much higher with that. So I was always looking for a new hobby. And yeah, true crime, it was there for me. It was just as the podcasting world was taking off. I then had another incident in my life where I needed an escape. So I'm pretty sure that everybody will have heard of the Grenfell Tower incident in London. I was there on the day. It was my old employer, and I was there on the day. I should have actually been working there on the day. So woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and my wife is telling me that I better turn the news on because there is a report of a fire in London. Turn it on, all of a sudden see this tower block on fire, and I think to myself, I really ought to get myself down there. So 5:30 in the morning, I've jumped in my car, got there about 6:15, and I spent the day at the respite centres. And from that, I had rather significant anxiety attacks to an extent where I actually had what hasn't quite been diagnosed as PTSD, but the doctors actually suggested that it might have been PTSD, considering I had a panic attack when I stood next to a bonfire in November of the same year, and I needed something as an escape. So what I did was I started looking into crime cases. That was back in November 2017. Never even really thought about doing a podcast back then, but it wasn't until later in April 2018 when I was actually on holiday with my wife, my best friend, and her best friend, who ended up being our maid of honor and best man. And we were in Malta, and we decided we were going to do we were going to write ourselves a few things that we were going to do. I was going to do a 40 before 40. And one of the things that I had on there was the fact that I was going to write, produce, and release my own podcast. Ashley, who's my wife, she said that it would be a great idea for me to use some of my sort of creative side of me to actually start writing it. And she guaranteed me that I would have at least one listener, because she would listen to every episode, whether they were absolutely rubbish and nobody decided to listen to them or not. But she decided that she was going to support me all the way. So in October 2018, I got started on my first script. My first script hasn't actually been released yet. My first script is going to be my episode 10, which is going to be a case of Lee Rigby, who was a British soldier who was killed in a in a hate crime incident in the centre of Greenwich. But I'm quite sure that we'll discuss that a bit later on. So that's how we got here. And I recorded my first episode. I remember recording my first episode, who was Zofia Savodska, who was somebody who was killed here in High Wycombe. I recorded it on the 8th of January 2019, and I was in my garage. I believe it was about -1 centigrade. And because obviously garages are not insulated, it was freezing cold. My feet were freezing, my hands were freezing, and I was just thinking to myself, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Recorded a second episode again, but then released the one from the one with Zofia and the one about the Alrosa Villa shooting. And the response that I've got and the friends that I've made, Michael, on Twitter, and also the girls from our True Crime podcast and Steffi from One Eye Open, the Echo boys, it's been well worth it. As a one-man band, I'm pretty sure you know yourself, as a one-man band, it's really, really hard to try and promote yourself, record, write, edit, everything with regards to a podcast. But thoroughly enjoying it at the moment, thoroughly enjoying it.
True crime podcasts are just really hot, and I have trouble getting listeners for my podcast since it's not true crime. So I think you're doing pretty good. You're at episode 6 or 7?
The one I released on Friday was episode 7, who was Molly McLaren.
Yeah, that was very hard to listen to, that episode. It was about stalking, which is not considered a very, I mean, I don't think police give that enough weight when someone's being stalked, or domestic violence. That's violence that is not really given the same weight as, I don't know, a stranger on stranger murder or whatever. What are your thoughts on that, and how how the British police and how they accept stalking?
The way that I think that the British police accept stalking is, I think that stalkers personally should be treated the same way that sex offenders are. They're quite easily available to put sex offenders on a register. Why can't they put stalkers on a register? I'm going to give you three cases in example. You've got obviously the case that I covered in Molly, where the guy who's actually killed her has done the same sort of things, not killed people, but he's done the same sort of crimes to 2 other girls, both one of which has reported it to the police. The other one threatened him with, basically, if you do this again, I will go to the police. But I don't think that the British police take it as seriously as they should. It's kind of a case where the British police are looking at it of, oh, this person may be an ex-partner, and not looking at it from a long standpoint. I'm going to give you an example of another case that was covered on Sword and Scale, but I've seen quite a bit of it on documentaries over here, and that's the case of Alice Ruggles. She was a girl who used to work for Sky. She had a boyfriend who was a soldier in Edinburgh, and he would basically control her to the extent where he ended up driving down. She broke up with him, and he ended up driving down from Edinburgh to, I believe she lived in Newcastle, to stab her to death in her own kitchen because she was meeting up with somebody else. It's kind of a case where these guys, they can't accept no for an answer. I mean, don't get me wrong. We've all had rejection in our lives. We've all had rejection in our lives. And we've all maybe said a few things about females that may not have been completely respectful, but never going that far. Never going that far. If somebody accepts it, you badmouth them behind their back to an extent, but just leave it at that. You know, you just talk amongst your friends, but you never get to the stage where you want to kill somebody. I can't fathom that in my head. I really can't fathom it. But there's so many cases now. one of the things that's massive in the UK at the moment is all these stabbings. I've said for a long while that unfortunately we live in the PlayStation and Xbox generation where a lot of these kids think to themselves, all you've got to do is switch it off and switch it back on again, and these people, these people are going to come back to life like they do in the Xbox and PlayStation games. It doesn't work like that. But I honestly think, with regards to stalking, and there's one person who I really, really need to say has done a fantastic job, and that's Laura Richards. She has done quite a bit for stalking in the United Kingdom and in the United States. I believe she's set up Paladin.
She's in a podcast as well, Real Crime Profile.
She is, yes. Yeah. So I have a lot of respect for her because, in fact, actually, Real Crime Profile was the podcast which gave me the influence of focusing my stories from the perspective of the victim. Because, as I said in my intro episode, it's kind of a case where everybody knows Ted Bundy. How many of Ted Bundy's victims can you name? Everybody knows about the Son of Sam. Everybody knows about the BTK. How many of their victims can you name? So that's why my podcast goes from the standpoint of the victim, and that is thanks to the Real Crime Profile podcast, because the way that they covered the Oscar Pistorius case and with focusing it on Rena Steenkamp, it held me, it gripped me, and that was the way that I thought to myself, right, this is the way that I have to go, because too much attention is being given to these people who are committing these heinous acts, so they're going to be the ones that are remembered. But these people who are unfortunately either in the ground or have been cremated, where's their voice? And that's why I've gone from the standpoint that I think I should focus on the victims. And with regards to stalking, who knows, when is it going to be as serious a crime as I said earlier, as being a sex offender? It's still an offence where the person who is the victim either ends up dead or they are mentally scarred for the rest of their lives. So how long are countries going to accept that we need to do something more drastically when it comes to stalking? I could list cases for days about stalking, and as I said in my last podcast, the job that I do at the moment, I only see the aftermath. So I sometimes see people who come into our office who've been the victim of domestic violence, who've been stalked and need rehoming because they've finally got away from their abuser. So I only ever see the aftermath, and I see the damage that it does to these people. And to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. The way I see some of these, especially ladies who come into the office, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. So I would love to see somebody who actually has some clout when making laws to sit and talk to victims about what they've gone through, and then they might actually understand the seriousness of this offence.
Let's talk about your process in producing your show. What do you use for materials? Are you do mostly computer research, or do you do books, or both, or?
So I do any material that's available to me. Basically, I always start with a good old fashioned Google search, see what you can pick up, and then if I find that there's a book. I've used books on a few of my podcasts. So the ones like I used a book for Colette Aram. I've used a book for the case of Jackie Paul. I've used a book for the case of Lee Rigby. But I also use documentaries as well. So if there's any documentaries on the subjects, I will watch them. There's a case coming up that I'm going to be covering, which there was a biographical film written about it, so I'll make sure that I watch that. It's kind of a case where I digest everything that I can about this case, and pick up bits from books, bits from newspapers, bits from, if, for example, there's a charity set up in the name of the victim, you can usually look at the website and you find quite a bit of information with regards to that person. I would pick up information from, if, for example, there's another podcast on the subject, I may go out and listen to that, because that's one of the other things that I do. I don't want to cover the same sort of cases that everybody else is covering. So the first thing that I do is I search. If I find a case that I'm interested in covering, I go and search the Apple podcasts, I go and search Stitcher, I go and search Google, and try and find out if there's another podcast about the person. If there's 2, 3, 4, 5 podcasts about this person, I move on, because I'm sure that there's other people's stories that I need to tell. So I would move on and move on to another case where it's not so well known. But if there are other podcasts, then I would listen to them, try and get a bit of information out of them. And then what I would normally do is I would probably say I spend 3-4 days researching the case, collate it all into one document. And then what I would do is I would split it, have 7 documents. I would split it up, for example, into about the victim, anything that's known about before the crime, about their life, for example, anything that I can find about the actual crime itself, anything about the investigation. I try and include anything that I can with regards to the funeral, because I feel that if you can include any information with regards to the funeral, it kind of brings it back to making it personal about the victim. So I'd see if I can find anything about the funeral, like, for example, the dates, where it was held, anything that was specific about that event. And then I would go onto the court. I would go onto the court side of things, anything that I could find about the court case. So in some of my podcasts, I've gone quite deep into the court process, and you often find from court documents that there's a lot of information. For example, the case that I was mentioning earlier about Nicholas Ingram and J.C. Sawyer. A lot of the information that I got from there was from an appeal that was lodged with the state of Georgia. So I got a lot of information from the court documents from there. And then what I would do is I would find out if there's anything like, for example, the aftermath. So like a case that I've just recorded literally today, I've got a case where I've got a lot of information from the family of the victim, talking about what effect the whole process or the whole crime investigation and the legal process has had on them. And I would then try and end it with that, because once again, it gives a personal sort of side of things to it. I would then, what I would do is I would collate it into like an order, fact checking everything, collate it into a sort of an order where I've got a logical running order. What I would normally then do is I would print off that Word document, and I would sit with a good old fashioned pencil, read the thing aloud, because when you read things on paper, it's completely different to when you read things aloud, because what you may see on paper is what you are saying in your head. Then when you get into the studio to read it out and you read it out loud, it kind of sounds stupid. So you need to read it out loud and edit it before you get into the studio, because you then, a lot of times that I've done, especially with my first few episodes, is I've wasted a lot of time recording and re-recording the cases, because you think to yourself, that sounds really, really good. You record it, and then what I do is I convert it to an MP3 file, put it on a Google Drive, and I've got an hour and a half drive in the morning to work. So what I do is I would put my story that I've just recorded onto my podcast, onto my radio in the car, and listen back to it. And I always like to think to myself that the worst critic of yourself is always yourself. I can tell you, there's been times when I've actually shouted at myself at my own podcast because it's not come out the way that I've wanted it to. So what I've then had to do is I've had to go home, and rather than edit the podcast, I would go back and re-record it. And sometimes the process of recording a podcast can take an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then obviously you've got the editing on top of that. I would say, so for example, I've recorded a case this morning, which is an example of what I've just said about the fact that I'd recorded it previously and listened to it and thought to myself, this sounds absolutely terrible. So I don't want to put out, I know I don't get paid for it. I know that it's just a hobby, but I still have my own standards to keep to. So what I did was I realized that I realized that it sounded no good, and that's me in my own head. And I'm thinking to myself, if it don't sound any good to me, then what are the people that are on, what are the people that are on Twitter? What are the people that are on Reddit going to say? And I kind of overanalyzed it from that sort of aspects of things. And I re-recorded it. And this morning, I would say that the re-recording of it has gone from probably about a 4 or a 5 out of 10 to probably about a 7 or an 8. You never think to yourself that what I've released is perfect. I mean, the closest thing to an episode that has hit home to what I wanted it to be was my last one. So yeah, the whole process, I would say, of actually recording a podcast, this is around a 9 to 5 job as well, which includes 3 hours travel. I would say is probably 3 weeks start to finish till you're actually ready to release it. But the thing is that I need to try and get some in advance. So for example, if something happens to me like what's happened to Steffi from the One Eye Open pod, which, may I just say, if she does listen to this, get well soon, Steffi, because she's ended up in hospital with a bad throat. So it's kind of a case where if I get myself in a situation where I'm ill or I lose my voice, which was very much the case yesterday, nearly when I went to go and watch the football, I was shouting so much I nearly lost my voice yesterday. But if I get to the stage where I need to take a break, I've got a couple of episodes that I am ahead. So if I want to take a long weekend off, for example, and not do anything, because the majority of my stuff is done at a weekend. The majority of my stuff is done when I actually get free time to myself, whether it be my lunch hour, whether it be when my wife's sitting and watching trashy TV. It's kind of a case where I just sit on my phone, do as much research as I can, do as much writing as I can. But the thing is, I sometimes look at this as a second job, but unpaid. But the thing is that once I would never stop doing this I'd never do this if I didn't enjoy it. The one thing that I do enjoy is knowing that people are actually listening to me out there. I mean, I don't know what sort of setup you have when you're recording, but I'm currently at the moment when I'm talking to you, I'm sitting in a box that has been made for me by my wife, which is an MDF. It's about the size of a portaloo, made out of an MDF, which has got soundproofing all around it. And the idea that I'm just talking to myself in a microphone, it's quite scary. But when you see the reactions, for example, on Twitter, on Facebook, etc., that people have really enjoyed your work, that's when it makes you think to yourself, yeah, I want to carry on with this. I'm really enjoying it. But the one thing that I really need to do, I don't know whether you've noticed it with the way that I'm talking to you now, I often talk very, very, very fast. And the one thing that I need to do when I'm recording my podcast is I have to appreciate that there's people across the world that don't understand my accent, that don't understand what I'm saying if I say it so fast. So I have to deliberately make a conscious effort to slow down and make a conscious effort to actually try and not talk with my normal accent and try and talk to you as if I'm a broadcaster. But it's just things that you just learn and you just pick up.
How about your theme music? Did you write that, or did someone write it for you, or?
No. So basically, what happened with my theme music was I didn't expect anybody to listen to me. As I said to you earlier, I didn't expect anybody to listen to me. And what happened was I needed some theme music, and I didn't even think about it. So what I did was I went on to one of these websites that you license free music, and I just heard this one that was like a creepy circus, and I thought to myself, oh, I absolutely love that. So what I did was I put it as my theme tune, did it for about 4 episodes, and now all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, I don't really think that theme music fits with my episodes. So yeah, this is a world exclusive. My theme music will be changing from episode 13 because that was when I planned on finishing my first season, but I don't really think that the creepy circus is going down too well with people, to be honest.
How about your incidental music? Did you get that on the same website?
So basically, what happened with the rest of the music that I use, I had no idea how to edit a podcast, and one of the guys who I am very close with, once again, who was in my wedding party, he works as a voiceover artist, so he's got access to all the websites with regards to music and stuff like that. So he gave me some music to use, and funny little anecdote for you. So my wife, she first of all didn't understand what ambience meant. So when I was talking to her about ambience music, she thought I'd said ambulance music. So she genuinely said to me, why do you want to stick throughout your podcast knee nor? So she genuinely thought that I'd said ambulance music rather than ambience music, and I'm pretty sure she's going to kill me for actually saying that. To the extent, Michael, where you might actually be able to write your own first true crime podcast about me, when I've been murdered by my wife, to be fair. But yeah, so she's been really, really supportive of me. She really has. But the music that I got, I basically I went to Alex, who was the guy who's been doing a lot of my editing for my first couple of episodes, and he basically has told me that, you know, if I don't like what I'm saying in my episode, all I have to do, just simple clap, because what happens is on the sound graph, it comes up as a straight line, so you can see where you've made mistakes with regards to your editing. So what I would do is I would go through and I'd edit it from that, and then he's taught me how to sort of do a multi-tracks mix where I can put my back-in music and my M music, and I've got to the extent where the one bit of the end of my podcast, which I love doing, is take care everybody, and then just getting the drop of the end music just to hit just after I've said take care everybody, because I just like the sound of it. I'm not very musical myself. I've tried to play guitar, I've tried to play drums, I've tried to do all of that sort of stuff. So I'm not very musical myself, but I know that when I listen to it, I've got to make sure that the mixing is fine, because the one thing that you notice, especially with some podcasts that have really, really good stories, but then they lack in the editing sometimes. I mean, fortunately, it's none of the ones that I really listen to, but it's kind of a case where you notice that people are over trying doing what they're doing with the music, and people are here to listen to your voice. As long as you've got something in the background that kind of hides I'm sitting in a garage, and I can guarantee you 9 times out of 10, I will either have an aeroplane flying over, I will have a helicopter, I will have anything like that. I've just got that little bit of music in the background just to mask any noises. Like I've got a heater in the garage as well. Every now and then it just keeps clicking. You know, it just hides the impurities in the background, and that's all I use the backing music for. If it adds to the podcast, then fantastic, you know. But that was the whole aim of putting the backing music in initially, was to try and hide the impurities of what was going on. especially when I didn't have the soundproofing. I've got the soundproofing now. I've got a reasonable mic now. But when I had the impurities, it just masked them basically. But yeah, I mean, with regards to if I'm now starting to think to myself, if I've got people that really want to listen to this, I'm going to have to start changing a few things. So, I'm like, for example, in my last episode, I've tried experimenting, with I stuck the Scottish national anthem in over the bit about the funeral. So it's kind of a case of just a bit of trial and error, see how it sounds. So maybe it might be a case where in the long run, if I've got a bit that's leading up to a bit dramatic, then I might change the music in the background. But my main focus at the moment is the story and focusing on the victims, and then the rest of the production of the podcast, although it's important, comes secondary.
So you use a condenser mic?
I'm not 100% sure what mic this is. This is because I'm talking to you on it at the moment. I'm using a condenser mic. I'm not 100% sure what microphone it is, but it's one that my friend has recommended to me. It's the same one that he uses when he does his voiceover art. So what I do is I sit here with the microphone on the arm, with the pop mic, with the pop filter, over the mic. I've got my iPad to the left hand side of me, which holds the script, and then I've got the laptop underneath the desk. That's basically all my equipment is. It's nothing flashy. I've got I'm not even 100% sure what they call it, but it's one of those things like a relay thing where you can hear automatically what you're saying through your headphones into the microphone. But I've got one of those as well. I'm not. It may, as I say, I'm not very technologically sort of expert when it comes to these sort of things. It's kind of a case where I just went to my mate, what do I need, and how much is it going to cost me, and he sort of sorted me out with the equipment. And I had a change of equipment from episode 4 onwards, so I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that the quality of the actual recording is a lot better than it was.
Just for the listeners, the difference between a condenser mic and a dynamic mic. A condenser mic is what maybe the radio station DJs use. You have a broader range of tone. A dynamic mic is a mic that usually a singer in a band would use. It is developed. Its main purpose is to pick up just the voice of the singer and not the other musicians playing around them. So with a condenser mic, you may pick up the airplanes and the car going down the street and the heater coming on and going off. With the dynamic mic, you have to talk really close to it, and you're less likely to pick up the music outside, the ambient sounds from around you. Why don't you talk about when you produce your show? When is it released? Is it every Friday, every other Friday, so that the listeners will know when to tune in to your newest episodes?
Yeah, sure. So the last episode was released 2 days ago now. So I try and release, or I've set my episodes to release every other Friday. The reason I've done that is so that I can actually write in between. If I ever get to the stage where I've got anybody who wants to assist me with writing cases and things like that, I may eventually get to a stage where I can release it once a week. But I'm going to stick at the moment, especially with my day job, I'm going to stick to 2 weekly on a Friday. As I said earlier, available on all of the podcatchers, things like iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, things like that. So I'm going to give you another exclusive, Michael. Here you go. So I'm going to go through the next couple of cases that I'm going to be covering. The case that I'm going to be covering in 2 weeks' time is the case of Joanna Yeats, who was a girl who lived in Bristol in England, and she went missing around about Christmas time, and the landlord was the one who was deemed as the main suspect of the case, and the British press had an absolute field day with him because he was, shall we say, to be politely, a little extravagant. in his appearance. And the podcast is going to go into the whole of the background of her relationship with her boyfriend, and the whole thing of her going missing, then the investigation into the landlord, and the eventual outcome, etc. She was unfortunately found on Christmas Day, so it was a case where, can you really imagine every Christmas now for that family? It's, rather than Christmas being a time of year that families can celebrate and spend time together, every Christmas Day now is an anniversary of your daughter's death. And it looks at the kind of the ways that the police carried out the investigation, and the way that the media actually hampered the investigation, to the extent where the landlord, I don't want to go into too much detail because obviously that nobody will listen to it, but the landlord ended up on the Livingston inquiry, which was an inquiry, for everybody who else is listening, it was an inquiry in the UK which basically looked into the way that the media conducted themselves. It was looking into phone tapping and things like that was done by the News of the World and other newspapers, to be fair. And it focused on the way that the papers conducted themselves, and the way that they didn't go gung ho into assuming guilt before innocence, sort of thing. So yeah, that's my next case. And then the case after that is going to be the case of Lindsay Ann Hawker, who was a British girl who went out to teach English in Japan, and she was murdered by somebody who she was giving an English lesson to. And basically it was about a 3-year investigation before they ended up catching the guy. Once again, the podcast goes into her life, her passions, and it tells the story about the pain and anguish that her family went through, and in particular the expense, because this is one of the things that people don't look at. For example, the media and the public in particular are very, very quick to jump on the back of people that they see regularly in the media who are looking for people. And I'm going to use the McCanns as a prime example. Now, everybody looks at the McCanns and they think to themselves, how much are they enjoying the limelight? When you think to yourself, now I'm going to be careful when I say this, because you've got to think to yourself about the circumstances behind their daughter going missing. But you think to yourself that their daughter has gone missing. You are going home from a holiday without one of your loved ones that you went out there with, and the backlash that they suffer was very similar to the backlash that the Hawkers suffered when they went over to Japan, because they kept wanting Lindsay's case to be in the spotlight because they wanted to find her murderer, obviously, and they got a lot of abuse. But what people don't realize is the fact that yes, they were in the media a lot, but the search for Lindsay's killer cost them over £100,000 in airfares between the UK and Tokyo, and then obviously it's time off from work, and a lot of the Japanese public were blaming or saying to them that you're enjoying the publicity that's coming with the murder of your daughter, which I think's crazy. I mean, I've never had the feeling where I've had a friend go missing, and I've never had the feeling where I've not known what's happened to a loved one. And I hope, fingers crossed, touch wood, touch everything that's round here, that never happens to me, because I don't know how I deal with it. And I would search to the end of the earth, and I would make sure that I'm I'm everywhere. I mean, I'm bad enough on Twitter advertising my podcast. I dread to think what I would be like if I actually had to try and find, a family member. I would make sure that I'm on every single newspaper front of every single newspaper. I'm on the front of every single talk show. I would make sure that everybody knew that my loved one was missing. So how people can actually criticise families for wanting attention about the missing loved one, either to find the body, find the killer, or find the person, I don't think anybody should ever criticise anybody for always being out there. I really don't. Yeah, and then, as I said earlier, episode 10, I'm going to finally get to release my case about Lee Rigby. I've been a bit cautious in relation to the release of the episode about Lee Rigby because of the nature of the crime and the fact that it was based around the killing was actually based around religion. So if for anybody who's not aware of the case, he was a UK soldier who was hacked to death. I think the best expression is in the middle of in broad daylight in Greenwich. He was killed by two guys who were claiming to have committed the murder for Allah. Now, I'm trying my best to kind of tone down that episode as best I can so that I don't offend anybody. But it was one of those cases where it stood out. It stood out to me. I was in Egypt at the time when this murder took place, and I can remember packing my suitcase, and all I had on in the background was the fact that this guy had been brutally murdered in the middle of a London street in broad daylight in front of a bus. Once again, the whole episode goes into the what happened to him and the side of things with the aftermath, and there's quite a bit about Lee in that book in that podcast as well, because of the book that his mum released. So I've got quite a bit of information from that case. But it was kind of one of those ones where, as a brand new podcaster, you kind of don't want to throw out an incredibly controversial case as one of your first few that you release, because any listeners that you may have had, you don't want to kind of isolate anybody, because you've got to try and be able to have a little bit of experience about writing scripts, etc., before you can release a case like that, because you need to be able to report the facts, but make sure that the facts are not too inflammatory, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. To close out, why don't you give advice to anyone who may be thinking of starting a podcast, true crime or whatever? What would you tell them that you've now learned that you wish you had known before you started?
I wish that I'd known how long it was actually going to take. Basically, I would say to anybody who wants to start a true crime podcast or any podcast at all, is you need to be aware how much time you will be spending on this thing, and how much of your social life and normal life that you'll be giving up, how much time you'll be isolating yourself from situations because of the research that you're having to do, because of the investigations that you have to do. For example, if you want to do an investigation story into investigations, you need to be able to concentrate as much as possible on that case, because the thing is, the thing I've learned is that unless you're going to release regularly, you're not going to be able to get the audience based. And as I say, I started this as a hobby. I really did, and I thought probably 10 people, including my parents and my wife, would listen to it. At the last count, I was averaging nearly 600 downloads an episode, which is astronomical compared to what I thought I was going to get. I know that obviously you've got podcasts with bigger budgets and bigger advertising side of things that are getting much more than that. But for an indie podcast, I'm quite impressed. I'm quite impressed with the way that I'm going, and also the fact that my voice has been heard in 32 countries. It becomes an obsession. It really does. Your podcast becomes an obsession. Michael, I'm sure you'll back me up on this one, that you do spend so much time on Twitter, you spend so much time on Facebook, and you spend so much time thinking to yourself, is what I'm doing good enough? You know, am I really, are people really being this nice to me via social media, but behind my back they're thinking to myself, what an absolute pile of crap. You know, it's kind of one of those things where it brings out a lot of feelings in yourself that you have a lot of doubt. For example, I don't know how you feel, but sometimes when I'm recording my podcast, I have red light syndrome. So I would be able to perfectly form a sentence, but the second I hit that record button, all of a sudden I forget how to speak, and I'm having to edit left, right, and center. So the one thing I would say to anybody who's a producer who wants to record their own podcast is, don't worry about making mistakes. Mistakes can be ironed out in the final edit. It happens to the best of us. I couldn't even say my own name this morning. It took me 3 attempts to introduce my own podcast. You know, it happens like that. I would say to yourself as well, or I'd say to you as well, make sure that you get a break, because if you don't, you will start resenting what you love doing. If you start resenting what you love doing, then you don't enjoy it so much, and you'll just find that releasing an episode will be a chore, and it will show in your work. If you are half-arsing everything, then you know it is a case where it will come across in your work. You need to be able to dedicate the time to it, and you need to also, if you can, get somebody else to check your work, because what you may think is absolutely fantastic. A prime example of that was, I thought to myself the other day that I would release a tribute episode to the people who have been killed in the mosque attack in New Zealand. And I wrote something, I recorded something, and I sent it to somebody to listen to, and they were like, don't release it. Don't release it. It sounds horrible. It sounds as if you're trying to cash in on a tragedy. When I wasn't. All I was trying to do was try and pay homage to, the people who were actually killed in that incident. Nobody knew their names, but they knew about the guy who's gone in and shot up the mosque. So I tried to release an episode on that, and I sent it to somebody who said, don't release it. You'll cause yourself more issues than you will. You'll cause yourself more issues than what you're actually trying to desire, what your desired sort of effect is. So I would say to everybody, try and focus on something that you really enjoy as well. For example, I could probably do a podcast on true crime. I could probably do a podcast on the NFL. I could probably do a podcast on wrestling. But you have to try and find something that you really, really, really enjoy, because you need to be able to talk about it passionately. And as I say, it will become a second job. It will become your second life. You need to be able to give that as much love and affection that you would give a family member. You really do. My wife, we've been married for 8.5 months now, and she starts to think I'm neglecting her, and the conversations around the house mainly focus around the podcast. They really do. And you know, it's always a constant case of, oh, we've got to watch that because I need to research something to do with the podcast tonight, or look at this lovely review that I've received on iTunes, or these people have said something absolutely amazing about me on their podcast. Like when I had a review, or I had a little thing on the Our True Crime podcast. They said something about me which was really, really nice, and I tried to play it to my wife, and she's not the bloody podcast again. You know, it does take over your life. This is a thing as well. I mean, I listen to a lot of your podcasts, and to be perfectly honest, I really, really enjoy them because they're complete They're a complete break away from what I'm used to listening to. I mean, for example, I listened to that one on astronomy the other day, and I was sitting on the train, and I'm a Pisces myself, so I was sitting on the train and I was thinking to myself, yeah, everything that Rachel is saying now about what a Pisces is, it describes him perfectly. And I was listening to you as well, and you said when she spoke about what there was about you, you were like, yeah, that's me perfectly down to a T. So I think that, especially with your podcast, you've got such a range of wonderful, amazing topics that you can cover. You're not restricted to the one genre. You are covering so much. You've got such a diverse sort of range of things to cover, and it's kind of one of those things where you want to tune in the next week because, for example, you've gone from a guy who's looking for his family across the United States to an astrology podcast to having a host of a true crime podcast on your show. You know, it's kind of I would love to know what's coming next, because the way that you conduct your podcast and the way that you interview your guests, it's such a great listen. It really is, buddy.
Well, thank you so much. And I certainly appreciate you coming on my show. It's been a wonderful conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we go?
Once again, just literally, if you want to come and have a listen, I'm on iTunes. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at True Crime Fix Pod on Twitter. If you want to come and follow me on Facebook, it's True Crime Fix Podcast on Facebook. Or there's also True Crime Fix Discussion, which is a closed group. So if you want to post things in there, you're more than welcome to. And it's in regards to anything that's related to true crime, especially the discussion group, because I'm quite happy to discuss anything with anybody. And as you've probably picked up, in this podcast, I don't have any issue talking to anybody. And that's another thing with regards to what you were saying earlier about any advice to anybody who's doing their own podcast. Don't be afraid to talk to people. Don't think to yourself that, oh, I'm too busy to interact with people who want to listen to you. That's the one thing I would say to you, and that's the one joy that you get out of this business that we do. It's interacting with people and the banter that you have with people on online, especially on Twitter and things like that. It really does make your day, and especially when you continue a thread with people and just talking to new people from across the world. I would recommend anybody, if you've got a subject and you've got the time, go ahead and release a podcast. I really would.